Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn didn't stop running until they were able to reach the village, so that was a while. And once they were safely hidden, they signed a blood compact, like pricked their fingers with a needle and signed a contract with blood, that kind of blood compact. And the promise was to not tell anybody what they saw that night. Because who knew? Maybe adult Joe wouldn't get caught or convicted somehow. And what if he came looking for them for revenge? These boys just literally saw this man get his revenge on another guy. And by the way, this other guy is now dead. So they decided no, they were not going to tell anybody what they saw. Now let's go back to the graveyard. Muff Putter was still unconscious. Dr. Robinson was still dead on top of Muff Putter. And adult Joe was still there and still a murderer. So adult Joe, the murderer, put the knife into Muff Potter's unconscious hand and waited. It was maybe 5 minutes more before Muff Potter woke up, and immediately he saw all of the blood that was on him, not to mention the dead body that was on top of him. He asked Joe the murderer what had happened, and Joe said, "You killed Dr. Robinson." Muff Potter was in denial at first. I mean, rightfully so, he didn't do it. But eventually he accepted it because he thought that he was drunk before doing the job and he might have flown into a rage somehow, and he killed Dr. Robinson in the process. Muff Potter begged Joe the murderer not to tell anyone. And Joe the murderer got to act like this benevolent, generous person and promised that he will stay quiet. And also that he and Muff Potter should probably leave now and go their separate ways so that nobody would think that it looked suspicious that they were together. Muff Potter was infinitely relieved. He knelt down in front of Joe the murderer and thanked him for this. And then he ran off, but he forgot his knife. His knife was still there in the crime scene, and Joe the murderer did notice that the knife was still there, but he left it, and Joe the murderer went away. By noon the next day, word had already spread of a murder, because apparently someone found Dr. Robinson's body at the gravesite, and someone recognized the knife in the crime scene to be Muff Potter's knife. The news was so huge that the school was even canceled for the day because I guess everyone had to process. The whole town drifted towards the graveyard to see what had happened, and Tom Sawyer was in the crowd too. It was the last place that he wanted to go. He wanted out of it. He didn't want to be part of this narrative, but he just went. Huckleberry Finn was in the crowd too. He grabbed Tom Sawyer's hand and they had this look between them, and they got so paranoid that they had to look around and see if anybody noticed that knowing look that they exchanged. But everyone was just watching the graveyard because it looked like a graveyard robbery, which was true, that had gone wrong, and nobody had time to look at these two boys, you know. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn noticed that Joe the murderer was also in the crowd, and as they shivered, a commotion happened behind them. It was Muff Potter. He was sneaking back to the grave to get his knife, while a whole crowd was there. So when people saw Muff Potter, they were like, "Get him!" And of course the sheriff went and arrested him. Muff Potter broke down right there in front of the crowd. He spotted Joe the murderer, and he just asked Joe the murderer to tell everybody what had happened. He gave up, and so Joe the murderer told everybody that Muff Potter killed Dr. Robinson. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn were frozen solid. They expected a lightning to come and smite Joe the murderer because isn't this what the Bible said? Isn't this what Sunday school said? Like, we were promised a lightning, sir. But no lightning came for Joe the murderer, and the boys internally resolved even stronger to really not tell anyone. So Muff Potter was arrested. There was an inquest that was held shortly after where Joe the murderer lied under oath and said the same thing, that Muff Potter killed Dr. Robinson. And at school, inquests were now the new game that all kids played. They would hold inquests over dead cats. Kids played a lot with dead cats back then, I realize. Anyway, Usually, Tom would be all over new games like this, but this time, Tom avoided this game at all costs. He couldn't sleep. He would constantly dream about blood and moth putter. It was a very horrifying time for Tom Sawyer. The last straw for Tom was Becky falling sick. She was gone for a long time, and Tom even stopped playing altogether. He had fallen into a kind of depression. Aunt Polly tried to cure it. The latest trend in the medical world at that time was cold water baths. So Aunt Polly dragged Tom every day to the shed and basically waterboarded this boy with cold water. But that didn't really do anything. So she tried hot water next time because that was the new trend. So she was basically drowning Tom in hot water. And then the next trend was painkillers, which in that time period was mostly just alcohol. So Aunt Polly literally left Tom with a bottle of alcohol, and luckily Tom just fed it to the cat. But one day, Tom was hanging out in the schoolyard when Becky came into school. She was all good now. So Tom was so happy. He started doing cartwheels again. He started pulling hats off of kids, and he tumbled his way to Becky, and he almost collided with her even. But Becky, she was still upset with Tom, like they'd never talked since the fight. She was like, ugh, someone's showing off again. It's so annoying. And with that, Tom gathered himself up. His face was bright red. He was humiliated. And he ran away from school again. So Tom ran away from school, and this time it was for real. He even started to cry when he heard the school bells ring right behind him because he realized that this would be the last time that he would hear it because he was running away for real now. And anyway, everybody hated him, so he might as well just do everybody a favor and just leave. To be fair, only Becky hated him, but to him, the world hates him now. So Tom kept walking away when all of a sudden his best friend, the other Joe Harper, came out of nowhere, and he was also crying. So Joe Harper was crying because his mom thought he drank the cream from the kitchen, but he didn't. He honestly didn't do it, and he got scolded for it anyway. So Joe Harper is a little bit like Tom. He skipped school too. He's very similar to Tom. So his mom scolding him for cream was not something out of the ordinary. It was something that he would do. Anyway, this time Joe didn't do it, and he decided that he wasn't loved anymore, and he would just obey his mom's wishes now and just run away. Joe Harper's plan was to go into a cave and live as a hermit. He was at least self-aware enough to know that he wouldn't last very long, so he fully intended to die soon because he's banished off into a cave. But Tom was like, no, let's be pirates instead. And Joe was like, sure, okay, actually, that sounds a lot better. The two boys decided that they would need a third pirate, so they recruited Huckleberry Finn, who had his calendar wide open anyway, so he was like, yeah, okay, let's be pirates. The boys went off separately for a little bit to gather things that they needed to run away, and that night at midnight they met at the shore so that they could gather all of their things and to also steal a boat. They came up with a slab of bacon, a skillet, and tobacco. Tobacco's just for Huckleberry Finn, but he brought enough for everyone. And then the kids stole a boat to go to an island called Jackson's Island. Jackson's Island is a small island off of St. Petersburg. It has a sandbar, a beach, there was some woods. It's mostly uninhabited, so it was perfect for the boys. So the boys went on the stolen raft. As they sailed towards Jackson's Island, they looked back at St. Petersburg with broken but satisfied hearts. The first night they were in Jackson's Island, the boys had a blast. They reached the island at 2 a.m., but they weren't tired, so they played on the grass, they cooked some of the bacon they brought. It was glorious because they were free now and they could do whatever they wanted. They eventually laid down on the grass after all of that and made plans about being pirates. Huckleberry Finn eventually was the first to fall asleep because he was used to sleeping outside and anywhere. But Tom and Joe Harper started to get hints, just hints of homesickness. Also, they were guilty because they had just stolen the bacon and the skillet, and the Bible said not to steal, and they just did. So the boys made a mental note to never steal anymore, even though they fully planned to be pirates starting the next day, which the main occupation was to plunder. But this thought was comforting enough that both boys fell asleep soon after. The next day was the same. The boys had a blast all day. They would play in the beach, swim, explore the woods. They even caught fish for meals. They were very successful at that. They even noticed that the raft that they had stolen the day before had floated away, and that actually only made them feel more gratified that they had truly run away for now. But at nighttime, when they were all laying down, the boys started to get homesick again, and this time Huckleberry was also starting to feel it, but neither of the boys wanted to say it out loud. Suddenly, there was a loud boom. The boys ran to the beach to see what it was. It was a ferry boat with smaller ferry boats all around it, and the ferry boat was shooting cannons into the water. The boys knew what that meant, so back in the day, they looked for drowned people in the water by firing cannons into the water. The water would be disturbed enough that the dead body, if it was stuck underwater, it would float up. But these three boys kept looking at the ships and were like, I wonder who drowned. And eventually Tom said, wait, guys, I think I know who drowned. It's us. And instead of acting normally, like concerned, these boys were elated. They were so happy because this means that they were missed. This means that they were mourned. Hearts were breaking because of them. Tears were being shed. And accusing memories of unkindness towards them were probably being remembered right at this moment. The boys watched on, and the boats eventually went back after a whole night of searching, and the boys went back to sleep. But Tom was awake, and when he was sure that Joe and Huckleberry were really asleep, he picked up 2 pieces of tree bark from the ground, and he wrote on it with red keel. So red keel is like a stone that you can write with. It's like chalk. He placed one of the tree barks inside Joe Harper's hat and the other in his own jacket pocket. And then he ran as fast as he could to the beach. Tom swam most of the way back to St. Petersburg. He was able to secretly hitch a ride on one of the commuter ferry boats passing by, and eventually he was able to sneak all the way back to his home. He was outside and he looked into the window. There was Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and Mrs. Harper, Joe's mom. Aunt Polly, Mary, and Mrs. Harper were sobbing, and because of all the fuss, Tom was able to crack the front door open a little bit and ninja roll to hide under the bed. So the bed was basically right beside the door, and the group of people was on the other side of the bed. So when Tom rolled all the way to under the bed, nobody noticed him. Tom eavesdropped at the conversation about Mrs. Harper feeling sorry about scolding Joe that day, and Aunt Polly was also saying that the last time she spoke to Tom, she was scolding her about feeding the cat painkillers. And also, Tom learned that it was all true, that everybody in town thought that it was him, Joe, and Huckleberry Finn who had drowned. And the townspeople even found that raft that they stole floating in the water towards St. Petersburg, so they really thought that the boys skipped school to go swimming, and they couldn't get back on their rafts, so they drowned. Mrs. Harper, Mary, and Aunt Polly broke down again and cried into each other's arms. And Tom started to feel really sorry for himself. He didn't feel sorry for the women who were crying. He felt so sorry for himself for being quote-unquote dead that he almost started sobbing under the bed himself, and luckily nobody heard him. Eventually, Mrs. Harper had to leave and Mary and Sid had to get to bed. Aunt Polly was alone in the room now, and she started praying for Tom, and she prayed so earnestly that Tom almost felt sorry for Aunt Polly. He almost climbed out from under the bed to tell Aunt Polly that he was okay, but he didn't. He kept still until he was sure that Aunt Polly was really asleep before he came out. When he climbed back out, he watched Aunt Polly sleep for a little bit, and he took the bark from his jacket pocket. It was a note for Aunt Polly, and he put it on the bedside table right beside Aunt Polly, and he watched her sleep a little bit more when a thought suddenly occurred to him. So with that, he took the tree bark from the bedside table and put it back in his jacket pocket. Before leaving, he watched Aunt Polly again. It's getting creepy this time, but it was actually sweet. He felt sorry for Aunt Polly, so he kissed Aunt Polly before leaving without anybody noticing him. And then Tom Sawyer swam back to Jackson's Island. It was a few more days until Sunday, and the search party for the drowned boys back in St. Petersburg, they kept on searching until Saturday, and when the boys couldn't be found, they set up the funeral on Sunday. Aunt Polly, Mary, and Mrs. Harper sobbed in the pews during service. Then the congregation started crying for the lost boys too. And lastly, even the preacher himself in the pulpit, he broke down too. And then the door to the church cracked open. The preacher looked up and froze. One by one, the eyes of the people in church looked towards the door and saw the 3 missing boys march in. It was Tom, followed by Joe, and Huckleberry shyly in the back. Aunt Polly and Mrs. Harper showered Tom and Joe with kisses and hugs. The sad thing was that actually nobody came for Huckleberry Finn, not even his dad. So he was just standing there alone. But Tom realized this, and he forced Aunt Polly to celebrate Huckleberry Finn too, which she did. And then the whole church erupted in song. It was the happiest service ever in town. Which, I mean, this is all wholesome, but I feel like someone should be asking the boys what happened. And what happened was that the boys played on the island the whole week until the funeral, and they did that on purpose. In fact, Joe and Huckleberry Finn wanted to swim back to St. Petersburg a lot earlier. It was like the day after Tom snuck back into St. Petersburg, and they actually started swimming back, but Tom stopped them and said, "Okay, this is the plan. Let's go back during the funeral so that we could listen to our own funeral." And the 3 boys were like, "That's actually a great plan." So that's what they did, and they were hiding in the church the whole time on Sunday listening to their own funeral. Anyway, so there was no real consequence for these boys. The next day at school, they were the most popular kids because everybody wanted to hear about their adventures on the island. They were pirates. And Becky, poor Becky, she truly missed Tom during this time. She thought he was dead. So now that he's back, she was like, let bygones be bygones, let's be friends again. So she approached him in the schoolyard. But Tom ignored Becky. He decided with all this popularity and glory, he didn't really need Becky anymore because he was a hero now. So he just kept talking to other kids about what he did on the island. But Becky was like, okay, 2 can play at this game. Becky started inviting kids to a picnic. This was all within earshot of Tom. She invited everyone that she could see. She was telling everyone that it was going to be fun. And then Tom started talking to Amy Lawrence. He pretended that he couldn't hear a word that Becky was saying nearby, and he kept his attention all on Amy Lawrence. And Amy Lawrence, poor Amy Lawrence, didn't even realize what was happening. She was just happy to be there to be with Tom. Eventually, Becky gave up and stomped off to class. She was devastated. She was humiliated. Fast forward to recess. Tom was still at it. He knew what card to play, and that was Amy Lawrence. He was still chatting up Amy when he realized that Becky wasn't even there. He eventually found Becky in the classroom still, and she was alone with a boy called Alfred Temple. Becky and Alfred's heads were really close together because they were looking at a picture book together. Jealousy ran red hot through Tom's veins, and suddenly Amy's voice, she was still with him, it started sounding so annoying to Tom that he couldn't take it anymore. That noise from Amy and that sight of Becky with another boy, Tom couldn't take it. So he ran away from school again because he was thinking at least at home he was still worshipped by Aunt Polly. But he was wrong because Aunt Polly was furious at him. So what happened was that morning, Tom told Aunt Polly that while he was out on the island, he missed Aunt Polly so much that he dreamt of her, and he described his dream to be the exact scene at the house when he snuck back that night to eavesdrop. He got everything down in detail, like word for word what was said, how the candles flickered. Aunt Polly had gone off to Mrs. Harper to tell her how her Tom missed her so much that he was touched by the heavens with some psychic clairvoyance so that he could see Aunt Polly while he was away from her. But Mrs. Harper was like, yeah, no, Joe already told me everything. Tom was under the bed that night. So yeah, when Tom went back home for lunch, expecting that Aunt Polly to still treat him like a divine boy, he was scolded by Aunt Polly instead. Aunt Polly was really hurt. It was deception after deception after deception. But Tom said, okay, truthfully, yes, he did eavesdrop that night, but he did try to leave a note to Aunt Polly to tell her that he was okay, but he just made a bad decision and put the note back into his jacket pocket. And also, he did kiss Aunt Polly while she was asleep. He watched her sleep. Aunt Polly, at the thought of him watching her sleep and kissing her while she was asleep, she was so touched. She didn't even need proof from Tom. She just forgave Tom and sent him back to school. And actually, throughout the day, Aunt Polly would worry about that note. Tom's jacket was right there at home, and she was too afraid to check it for the note because if it weren't there, then it meant that Tom had lied again, and she probably couldn't take that anymore. Eventually, she did take the jacket and looked inside, and indeed, there was a note. And all was forgiven for Tom. So back at school, Becky and Alfred were still looking at that picture book, and suddenly, Becky realized that Tom wasn't even in school anymore, and she got really humiliated and upset that she yelled at Alfred to just go away. She doesn't care about this stupid picture book. And Alfred wasn't stupid. He figured out almost straight away that he was probably being used as a pawn in some sort of standoff with Tom. And instead of getting his revenge on Becky, who was the one who used him, he decided he would get his revenge on Tom. So he crept back into the classroom and poured ink all over Tom's notebook. That was the sort of thing that you can get in trouble for in school. But what he didn't notice was that Becky was still right there, and she saw everything. But she didn't say anything. She didn't call out Alfred right there and there. She was like, you know what? Yeah, Tom deserves that. Shortly after, Tom reached the school. He was in a much better mood now after talking to Aunt Polly, so he approached Becky and apologized to her about the way he was acting, and he said he would never do it again to her. But Becky, she's still in the heat of the moment, so she yelled at Tom to mind his own business and stay away from her. And these two kids started screaming at each other. They were full on cursing at each other whenever they would pass each other by. So after that initial fight, they would just walk around school. And whenever they would catch each other's eyes, they would just curse at each other. Eventually, they were separated, and Becky was just walking alone around the school when she passed by their classroom and noticed that hey, actually, the teacher's drawer is unlocked. So their teacher, called Mr. Dobbins, was known to have a mysterious book in his drawer. Every time that he had the class do some exercises on their tables, Mr. Dobbins would pull out his book from his drawer and read it to pass the time. And nobody knew what that book was. It was mysterious. There were theories, but nobody really knew what it was. Becky crept into the classroom and opened the drawer. She took out the book, and then she opened the book. It was a naked body. So before your mind goes anywhere, this was actually a medical book. Mr. Dobbins had always wanted to be a doctor, but he couldn't afford to go to medical school, so he now just reads medical textbooks for fun. But all Becky saw were the pictures. Pictures of bodies and body parts. Suddenly, there was a shadow that fell on the book. Someone was behind her. In her shock, Becky closed the book quickly, but she also tore a few pages of the book. The person behind her was Tom. He was honestly just walking by. He didn't mean to do anything. But Becky was in shock and she started crying and yelling and cursing at him for sneaking up on her. She's never gotten in trouble in school before, and now it will be the first time that she will be hit by a teacher. And Tom was like, I was literally just walking by. Becky cursed at Tom again before running off, and Tom was like, okay, serves you right. Before long, class started. Tom's notepad was discovered almost immediately, so he got hit by the teacher as punishment. He denied spilling ink on his notebook, and Becky felt sorry at one point, actually. She even thought about speaking up and telling the truth, but she kept her mouth shut because at the end of the day, Tom deserved it. Tom, on the other hand, didn't really feel anything about the punishment. He was so used to getting hit in school that this was nothing. In fact, spilling ink in his notebook actually sounded like something he would do, so when he was denying, he was just denying it out of habit. But soon enough, the class had to do some work on their desks, and as is the norm, Mr. Dobbins settled down, drew his notebook out of the drawer, and opened the book. Tom and Becky stared at Mr. Dobbins. Maybe he wouldn't even notice. He would probably open another page and actually it wouldn't fall out. But as soon as Mr. Dobbins opened the book, the pages flew out. The whole universe fell quiet at this point. The class didn't make a sound, nor did the galaxy, as Mr. Dobbins rose and asked the class who did it. Everybody knew that it was just a matter of time before he would find out who did it. Mr. Dobbins could tell if you were lying just by looking at your face. So Mr. Dobbins started asking each kid if they tore his book. He got through 5 kids before he reached Becky. And Becky, she looked like a hunted rabbit. You didn't even have to ask her. She just looked guilty. But Mr. Dobbins asked anyway, due process. Rebecca Thatcher, did you... No, look at me. Did you... Becky at this point was already raising her hands as if to beg for mercy, but Tom suddenly stood up and said, I did it. The class was once again stunned. This boy had gone crazy, so Tom marched solemnly up to the front of the class to receive his punishment. He was basking in the loving and grateful gaze of none other than his Becky Thatcher. He was practically flayed by Mr. Dobbins because it was personal this time, but he felt nothing. He also got a 2-hour detention, but he didn't mind because he knew that at the end of detention, there was going to be a golden-haired angel that was going to be waiting for him. So that was the end of part 2 of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. You're probably wondering where this story is going because in part one, we witnessed a murder and someone got arrested wrongfully for it. And now part two was all about these two kids and their hormones. But I promise you that something is going to happen. It's all going to come together. Please stick with me. See you in part 3.